Okay, the next speaker is a true crypto OG and a big friend and supporter of this event, John Lilic. He's a crypto economic builder, seed investor, product development advisor, and philanthropist. He's in Bitcoin from 2013. He volunteered at Bitcoin Center New York City in 2014. He co-founded Code to Aspire. He was one of the first consensus employees and is one of the most active Web3 angel investors out there. And now is executive director at the Telos Foundation. So thanks, John, for the support and for being with us today.
Dobar dan. Good afternoon. Okay, so I probably don't have anything really intelligent to say about this topic. Admittedly, it's a very new sort of like interest area for me. And so maybe I can offer just a bit of perspective from the venture capital side, what it sort of looks like initially, and maybe some of that can be useful because I definitely think this community needs a really big kickstart for very, very large amounts of capital to flow in, because I think the ethos of what you're trying to achieve is fundamentally very important. You've got some really hard coordination problems that you're trying to solve. I would, and I'll touch upon this a little bit, I would say at the core, you should be very much thinking about self-sovereign identity and reputation systems. So obviously the last presentation, very, very insightful. So attestations are obviously going to be really important. Sybil attacks are going to be something you have to think about. Persona constructs and so on. And I can talk a little bit more about that in some detail. I also think, for what it's worth, maybe I can add a little bit of historical context with respect to Ethereum and some of our previous forays into DAOs, and then on the accelerationist topic, I think interestingly, meme coins and DeFi and all of the weird stuff that has emerged, which none of it was originally envisioned. Kind of gives a little glimpse into how weird things can get. Okay, so let me just start with self-sovereign identity, and it kind of ties into the history of Ethereum. Okay, so one of the core tenets initially when we started Ethereum was, actually we said we were going to build a world computer, but we didn't really build a world computer. AWS and Microsoft Azure built a world computer. We built some kind of like global US dollar bank infrastructure and finance layer, which we call the settlement layer, I guess. And from that now, there's all sorts of other things which are deriving and emerging, and I think they're finally starting to be useful. To build a global computer, a world computer, will still require solving very hard scaling problems, particularly around sharding. But all that to say, let's say the original vision of Ethereum sort of maybe wasn't realized and has versioned over time, and it's difficult to predict where and how traction will emerge. Likewise, it's difficult to predict what little sort of pieces of innovation emerge, which then turbocharge the next run, and how that appeals to users. And so when I think about the DeSci space right now, you know, and like I said, I'm like really dumb on this topic, and I'm learning. I'm very fascinated. But my buddy Ryan Zurer, this guy running a big VC called Dialectic, he was starting the psychedelic DAOs to finance psychedelic research, which I thought was really, really cool. Just because I do think psychedelics have an important role when used properly and effectively. And so anyway, that was sort of like, let's say, my first instance of like this stuff appearing on my radar. And obviously, my other buddy Paul Kohlhaas and some others, they're doing really interesting stuff. But actually, there's much, much more to it, obviously. So I'll give you another example, how I started thinking about this recently in a more probably formalized context, which is leading me to think about business models. So my wife is here, and she's actually a biologist. And she worked on a really interesting project where basically you've got these food labels, and maybe some of you heard this story already, but they estimate the expiration date, right? And those estimates are usually sort of like done by insurance actuaries, right, to reduce liability. And so they end up producing expiration dates which are sort of like probably a little bit optimistic insofar as the food can actually be just fine well past those dates. And so we get this like tremendous amount of food waste. Anyway, she and her startup that she was involved in, French startup, and of course this leads into all the administrative and coordination costs of doing science in the EU. They developed a food label wherein basically the kinetics, so the time temperature profile of, let's say, a package of red meat, as it would change with the cold chain changing over time, would grow a type of bacteria in a gel medium, and so the food label package would change color when actually it was not safe to consume. And so you get this like much more precise food label. So it sounds like a super interesting idea, and you sit there and you're like, wow, this is a great startup. But for many, many administrative and coordination cost reasons, they just basically went bankrupt. And the entire time they were struggling to find money. And so now you end up with like researchers spending tremendous amounts of time chasing, I mean, for us DeFi degens, a very small amount of money. Like, it's unbelievable. The mismatch is unbelievable. There's like super smart people spending tremendous amounts of time for, 100, 200,000 euro grant when, we have meme coins that are worth billions of dollars, right? So it's crazy. And so, then I started thinking about this stuff in a more profound and structured way. And it got me to thinking about potential business models going forward. So first of all, as a VC, I definitely want to invest in this space. And I think the extent to which the community can continue to do these kinds of events, continue to signal that, in fact, solving these coordination costs could be tremendous in unlocking tremendous, unbelievable value. So imagine if this startup I described had been able to sort of like avail of these kinds of tools, access pools of capital, and moreover build communities that are then sort of like tied into what they're trying to do. You can see how something like that could have been a very, very exciting project. So yeah. Then I started thinking about, okay, how could we actually realize this stuff? And I started thinking about DeFi and the way DeFi came into existence. And so before automated market makers and things like Uniswap, we had Ether Delta. If anyone was around Ethereum back in the day, yes. And have you remember using Ether Delta? It was a very painful experience. But then this like one innovation came in terms of how to pool liquidity and sort of like have this automated function that removed a lot of the pain. Suddenly there was a Cambrian explosion. And then of course applications came on top of that, such as Aave and Morpho and these DeFi lending protocols and so many other things, and now it's all very composable. And so actually you have this like parallel system which is competing and rivals to some extent the existing financial legacy system. And so, but along the way, it was very difficult to predict that whole journey. And so one of the things I would say is like, maybe try not to have very strong assumptions about how all of this will go. Traction can be very weird, and maybe that's okay. Going back to the acceleration point or accelerationist debate, like with decentralized systems, it's very hard to slow anything down because you can't control, by design, right? It's meant to be permissionless. So I was young and idealistic, and I thought we would build this system with great integrity where we would have self-sovereign identity and reputation, custody of our assets, and we would have this like free, open, fair, financial system that everyone could avail of. And to a large extent, that's true because anyone can now have basically a US dollar bank account with just your MetaMask account and some stable coins, and that's very powerful. But the reality is, it's a bit of a kind of like Frankenstein freak show with all sorts of weird things, generating ungodly returns without any sense or logic. And Now there's like celebrities launching meme coins, and these things are, I mean, one of them right now, I mean, it just crossed like 200 million as a market cap, and it's trading like 100 million a day in volume. It's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. So it's going to get weird, and I would say I'm more on the accelerationist side of the spectrum, and I'm not afraid of that. And so the extent to which you spend time, and this ecosystem spends time and resources trying to guard against weirdness that you can't predict, I think might drain resources and might be difficult to actually sort of, versus just doing the best that you can. And so one example is, I can imagine, for example, IP NFTs being used as collateral on DeFi platforms and sort of unlocking tremendous amounts of capital. And so the extent to which somebody can work on onboarding organizations that have lots and lots of IP, getting them to tokenize, and then putting those things on something like Aave could, in my opinion, unlock very, very large amounts of capital where those IP holders can then borrow against that and then deploy into various DAOs and various projects that you guys are working on. And so as a foundational concept, it seems interesting, but it's difficult to know how it'll actually be realized, because, like I said, nobody could have predicted, weird celebrity meme coins pumping to hundreds of millions of dollars in just a few days. Okay, and then I also just wanted to kind of like, and sorry, I'm just sharing thoughts off the top of my head, and I'd love to just have a conversation too. Yeah, coming back to self-sovereign identity and reputation systems. Okay, so establishing identity on-chain, persona constructs. Those persona constructs describe you in different contexts. They have attributes about you, right? So the example I often use is your gamer persona, and you have which games you play, how many points you have. You have your government KYC persona, your real name, your social security number, etc., things a bank might need to know. Then you can collect attestations against those. For example, you can go to a notary, and a notary can attest that your passport and driver's license and social security number are valid. And so now your KYC persona can be used to selectively disclose and or granularly authenticate. And so I think it's very important to think about this stuff, because the extent to which, for example, you share knowledge and or try to share IP rights and or try to fund things with real people, producing real results, will have to be anchored in self-sovereign identity and reputation systems, just because there's going to be so many people and groups trying to exploit what you're trying to do. So while everyone is very well-intentioned here in this room and generally in this community, you're also going to be probably targeted for very large exploits, and that's something you have to be very, very careful of. And so security is something that has to be foundational in your thinking. It's not just sort of like, how does this community solve coordination, reduce coordination costs, and increase funding to science, but also how do we do that in such a way that we're like, security maximalists. Unfortunately, there's definitely going to be very big hacks, even though that money would have been earmarked for a good cause. Yeah, and then the other thing I would say is just strictly from a self-interest perspective, as a VC, I'm obviously looking to find good returns, and I'm trying to stimulate the growth of new ecosystems and businesses. And you as entrepreneurs should be looking to obviously raise capital on favorable terms and or turbocharge your ventures as best as you can. And while I've been closely involved in Ethereum since the beginning, I like Bitcoin, I like lots of other chains. So I think you avoid being maximalists in the sense that there's tremendous opportunities. There's going to be lots and lots of new chains emerging. Obviously, when you look at something like, and again, I'm just speaking here from a markets opportunity perspective because people are trying to raise money, but you look at something like Solana, obviously it has a credibility problem with all this meme coin stuff, and I think there's a real hunger for legitimate projects that are actually doing good. And so you shouldn't be afraid to consider multi-chain worlds as well. There's also going to be lots of very, very interesting new L1s coming. So something like Aleo and something like Monad, these are ZK-based chains. And the reason that's going to be interesting, I think, in particular for this community is because many elements of what you are ultimately trying to achieve will be turbocharged with fully provable infrastructure. Okay, so the extent to which not only computational steps and storage operations, but basically any claims that you make. So I would also look in this direction as well, and these ecosystems will certainly be looking for fantastic new projects. So yeah, Ethereum is great. I definitely feel like DeSci on Ethereum is sort of right now growing tremendously. But also as entrepreneurs, you know, I would highly encourage you to think about a multi-chain world as well, and find whatever the best opportunities are for yourselves. Yeah, and then I guess just the last thing is I'm very, very motivated to do my best to try and send a signal to the venture capital community that actually this ecosystem is not just some like glorified kind of like charity case, you know, like where no, we're trying to do some good, but we have no idea how to make money. You know, people ask me like, what does it take to be a successful VC? And I say, well, you have to be stupid and lucky. And by stupid, I mean, you know, not actually stupid, but you know, a lot of VCs think they're really, really smart and they have strong assumptions about how something will go. And so they try to steer it in a certain direction. And very often, that's exactly the worst thing to do. And so I think while it's still a little bit early for this ecosystem to kind of like have a convincing case for how it's going to produce tremendous returns and, you know, revenue and all the things that the VCs are going to be like pestering you about when you try to raise money, I wouldn't worry about that, frankly. And I think if you guys figure out how to solve coordination costs, if you figure out essentially how to protect researchers from having to waste tremendous amounts of time chasing money, I think you'll play a foundational role in the economy, particularly in this digital economy to come. So, you know, that's kind of like for any VCs that might be watching this talk, that would be my message is I think this ecosystem should have lots and lots of space to just be left alone to experiment, and lots of things will get weird and many things will fail, but that's fine. And eventually there's going to be an interesting critical mass where this stuff, particularly, I think, again, I'm not trying to have a strong assumption, but I have a feeling that if you can figure out how to collateralize IP on these DeFi markets, or potentially even obviously trade them on decentralized infrastructure, you're going to see some really spectacular results. Okay, that's all I got. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Thanks, John, for the talk, and thanks for your support for the ecosystem as well. You mentioned self-sovereign identity, and something I see on the one hand is an essential for Sybil resistance and an essential for the AI-driven future that we're going towards. What are your sort of thoughts on the concerns around absolute invasion of privacy when all of your details are tracked? Of course, ZK is one thing, but also just using the triangulation effect of all the data that you're putting out there, being able to be used to identify you. Like, do you have any thoughts on this?
Thank you. Okay, so great question. It's a little bit complicated. With respect to ZK, I know you're quite knowledgeable, and maybe I'll just quick high level for those who might be a new concept. But essentially, what I said earlier, where you have your sort of identity, your canonical identity on chain. So it's like I've used this example many times, but like you wouldn't rent a car for the few days here that you're here in Belgrade if it means you put your license on chain forever, right? So nobody would like reveal that kind of information and put it on chain for something so trivial. But if you can have instead a proof that elements of your identity are sort of in line with what a car rental agency would require, such as that you have a valid license, and what goes on chain is just a proof that in fact those attributes about your identity are valid, then the car rental agency can simply validate that this proof has been generated and that it's valid and that it's on chain. And so in this way you can kind of like ensure data protection, which is one of the key requirements, particularly in this like GDPR and all this other stuff where you can't just disclose and have customer information floating around. So given that, ZK enables very high potential for data protection insofar as users can have sovereignty over their identity, because whatever they establish on chain, they obviously have a private key that controls that information. And then they can selectively disclose, rather than selectively disclose like a photo of your passport, you can selectively disclose proof that you have a valid passport, right? And so in this way, you can also ensure that you have a high degree of protection. However, you know, you still use Google, you still live in Europe, you still live in America, you still live, I don't know, in China, whatever. It's like, you know, I don't know, maybe we live in a simulation. It's generally speaking, I would say, very, very, very hard to, and it's getting more and more difficult to kind of have really strong protection and privacy. And so it's a bit of a philosophical question, like, do you just accept it and like get into these hyper-productive work streams, right? Like you go to Silicon Valley, everybody's using all the social media, everyone has like big Twitter accounts, everybody's using Gmail, I mean, some people are using Signal for certain kinds of communications, but generally speaking, I mean, we were just in China, in Shenzhen, and it's like, you know, you don't even scan your passport anymore. You just walk, it scans your face, and the gate opens, right? So, and that's the case not just only in China, but in many, many airports around the world. So, I think that it's more important the extent to which, first of all, you're able to have some measure of protection and selective. You know, you can kind of choose your flavor of privacy. I mean, there's some people that live totally off-grid and try to kind of remain totally off-grid. I think it's very difficult to do that in a modern, collaborative, high-tech environment. But the extent to which you can sort of have some spectrum of choice is very important. And yeah, I just, I mean, the honest answer is I don't think we're going to have a whole lot of privacy in the future. But it doesn't necessarily have to be such a bad thing, because, you know, Orwell, even though he's right about a lot of things, he's also kind of, it's also kind of interesting that we have less privacy now than ever before, but kind of like the world is safer than ever before, right? So there's a weird thing happening there. I think the extent to which we can very rapidly surface, you know, sort of like invasions of privacy, or let's say misuse of privacy by nefarious actors and governments, et cetera, and then kind of like collectively take action, is a barrier of protection. But yeah, maybe it's not a nice thing to say, but I just think going forward in the future, you kind of have to like make yourself open to the system, and it's going to know everything about you anyways. You just kind of like make peace with that somehow.
Hello. We spoke with your wife about microbiology and about blockchain, and I just want to know your opinion about it. Like, why microbiology, biology, and medicine, like in general, so far from the blockchain? And in terms of VC, so what kind of problems you have? Is it like a governmental problem, or like any other stuff?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the reasons for the gap between real scientists and the blockchain is because, you know, the blockchain people are just so absurd, and these people are serious. And but actually, if the serious scientific people understood that the absurdity of the blockchain can, you know, people can actually help reduce their coordination costs and bring lots and lots of capital into their space, then, you know, we can kind of like combine the two. And so it's remarkable. Like, so we have a lot of friends who and a lot of that is probably because these people are spending their time doing deep work, right? Like heads down, doing deep work. And then on the other side, it's like everything changes all the time. You have to be like on Twitter, and you have to be on Telegram, and you have to go to, you know, interact in these like rapidly moving conferences or communities where everything changes. So also one side moves very slow in a sense, and the other side is just like very, very rapid. And, you know, there's an incongruency in the type of work that's done. Yeah, so that's where I think this particular new DeSci movement can bridge the gap. So the extent to which, and it's not going to be like a VC bro like me that's going to bridge the gap. It's going to be like credible researchers and scientists who somehow figure out that actually these communities are very friendly and they have this kind of like set of characteristics that might solve some of your problems, especially on the coordination and funding side. And so I think there has to be a bridge. Just like with Ethereum, when we first started, initially there was a lot of like cypherpunks and you know, people like Nick Szabo. I mean, I'm not saying that he was into Ethereum. I'm just saying that was kind of the initial ethos. And then, and today you've got like, you know, BlackRock and major institutions, and my former company Consensus, we sold 30% of the company to JP Morgan. And so, and in the middle along the way, there was like finance people that sort of came into our ecosystem and figured out how to translate between the cypherpunks and the bankers and the financial institutions. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, by the way. I still like to think that I subscribe to a lot of the cypherpunk ethos. But in this DeSci space, there definitely needs to be an interim step where there's translation between the scientists and the biologists and the researchers and, you know, this kind of like a weird crypto ecosystem. And maybe that's the role of this community.
We still have like 2 or 3 minutes if someone wants to ask something. Okay, great.
Thank you. I had a question along the same lines. What's the current general sentiment amongst the VCs about the DeSci sector? Because, like you mentioned, it's been segregated for a while in terms of actual biotech startups and VCs that have a focus on biotech because it requires a certain domain expertise. And there is an opportunity for DeSci to bring in a lot of dumb money, so to speak, that helps the development of the sector, but at the same time, there's a risk of it being lumped together with meme coins and the other aspects of the blockchain industry that don't necessarily have scientific use cases. So how does the VC community feel about DeSci at the moment, because it's still early stage?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Very good question. So, yes, I would say that, again, it's one of those things that has a bit of a gap. The crypto industry, particularly Ethereum, so rapidly ascended that we now have institutionalized VCs that have multi-billion-dollar portfolios, and they've only been around for like 5 or 6 or 7 years. And so there is an element of naivety, youthfulness, and just like this razor-sharp focus. Thing is, with crypto, if you get it right, and a lot of that is you have to get lucky, the returns can just be so disproportionate that it doesn't make sense to look at anything else. Likewise, on the other side, I would say traditional venture capital that's focused on hard science and some of the spectacular research we see, you know, it's a very different kind of thing because it's sort of slow, potentially requiring tremendous amounts of capital, lots of burn, and then there's like, you know, maybe you have some equity in something that then develops an IP patent that produces a spectacular amount of money 15 years later. So there's a temporal distortion too, because, you know, on the crypto side of it, I mean, these things can move very, very fast. And so bridging the gap a little bit, I think is going to be a bit of a challenge. Like I said, for me personally, it was just seeing my buddy Ryan Zurer kind of focused on this psychedelic DAO research stuff, and I was like, what the heck is this? And that was like my first. So yeah. Also, many of these projects are interesting, but it's unclear to me at this time, and maybe I'm still naive about it, how and where the returns are going to come from. So I think that narrative evolving a little bit more. Again, I definitely think the extent to which rights, IP rights, and or the potential for IP rights going on-chain and participating in the DeFi ecosystem can be some kind of tremendous accelerant. And lots and lots of capital can unlock and flow in as a result. The extent to which venture capital realizes that it can invest in some DeSci community, which then solves some coordination problem, which then results in acquiring some IP, which then somehow it figures out how to tokenize. that's like I can see this kind of a thing turbocharging everything. But again, it's going to result in a bunch of weirdness. Yeah.
At what point do you think people would be able to apply for funding? Process.
Yeah, I mean, it already exists. It's like there are many of these DAOs that like manage like, I don't know, I think 20, 30, and like scientists are getting, you're funded by Vita DAO, right? Okay, he was funded by a DAO actually, so he can show the experience.
Not me, but my company, yeah. But I mean, it was just regular race. We came to VitaDAO, applied, community voted to give us a check, and that's it.
Did you have successful research, or were you pre-patent? Where were you in your research?
It was several years from starting the company. We have published several papers in top-tier journals. We secured a deal with Pfizer. So yeah, that was the stage.
There's a beauty of decentralized system is that people can decide to fund at which stage they want, and so you have a lot of early stage funders who are trying to bridge the valley of death, early stage preclinical trial research.
Yeah.
But you can even have grants of, like, to study, for scholarship. Any stage.
Yeah, and also the Vita, I think Pfizer invested them directly, meaning like there's something, so Pfizer, so it's like, it's already working, but it's like very experimental. And when I was listening to the guy from Pfizer last year in Berlin, he was like, we don't have a clue, what is this? As in like, there are certain, like there's a community, people meeting, blah, 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 but like, obviously it's very experimental at this phase, but the point is like the money goes through these DAOs to like legit companies, and like these infrastructures are already in place, but it's super early.
I just have a question. Do we have like 10 minutes for some random weirdness? Do you want to? Are you interested in talking? Okay, so, since this is science, right, and decentralized science, this is my new buddy Ian, and I had existential angst yesterday. Because of what he has to say. He's a quantum researcher, he's a physicist, mathematician, a very smart guy. So yeah, you want to do your thing?
I know a bit. I've read some papers. I'm not a fully qualified expert in all of the fields I'm going to touch on, though. Blockchain works through public-private key cryptography, and the money is actually tied to the private key. But the way that the money is sent is tied to a hash of the public key. And that public key is then used in transactions and to verify that the transactions are valid. And this is the way that all of the blockchains, with some very minor, possibly insecure exceptions, work. Last year, there was an algorithm published by DeSci Quantum in June 2023 that detailed how to break elliptical curves with only 1152 qubits on a physical chip. And then they would arrange them through a quantum network using fiber optics in order to create 7,000 logical bits and crack a Bitcoin quality elliptical curve in 10 minutes. And that matches the block time of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is the more secure UTXO model, which means that all of the money that's spent goes to a different address, and all of the money you have remaining goes to a different address. And there's no money left in the same address twice, which means there's a new public key every time, and it's a new math problem to solve every time. And they figured this was going to be safe until 2032, 2035, simply because there was no way that people could crack it in 10 minutes. You'd be able to, your transaction would go through, and there wouldn't be any money left to take. Ethereum, Solana, Cosmos, Polkadot, almost everybody uses a ledger system where the accounts are essentially permanent and the smart contracts are authenticated against a wallet address which has signed a transaction, which gives permission over that contract, and that contract is then able to do things like run DAOs. And that surprise paper has caught everybody a little bit off guard. We kind of anticipated like a 6-year advanced notice, or 4 years advanced notice before this would become a significant problem. So we're trying to make something that would last through the public-private key, apocalypse and break. Banks don't have much vulnerability because they can just update their SSL configurations and then they're fine as soon as the browsers support. And there was an experimental version of Chrome that supported public-private key cryptography that's post-quantum. But blockchains can't change that one piece. The Bitcoin.org and Bitcoin.com fork, or Bitcoin and Bcash as some people call it, was a change in the hash function. And the database was maintained. Everybody still had their money on Bitcoin Cash. But if you change the public-private key system, everyone's balance is zero. There's no longer any money. There's no longer any ledger. There's no longer any access to smart contracts. All of the rights have been revoked. And so there's a few migration strategies perhaps, but the critical issue is that we have to build more and something different. So I'm focused on post-quantum safe cryptography, looking at the NIST standards that were selected, not just the winner, but all of the candidates, and seeing which ones we can implement very quickly. John's, can read this Cheshire cat smile and nodding. He's like, yeah, it's bad. Any questions? Yeah. The thing that is a little bit tricky is that if you think of a qubit as a processor, there's a system of gates that surround that qubit, and the algorithm that they're using has to be implemented on the gates. So it's a mixture of hardware and generic. The DeSci Quantum is actually making their own quantum computer, which buys us more time. But I think that our hard cliff of there's absolutely no way that Bitcoin has any value would be 2027, based on their construction timeline. But their research projects made us take it to zero in the meantime.
Yeah, so I think maybe just a comment. So as a DeSci society, or whatever we want to call ourselves at this particular moment in time, wouldn't this be the type of research that we should fund immediately? Like, how big is your team and how much money do you need?
7 people? There's a lot of things that we would need besides just programmers. It would be great if there was a zero-knowledge system that worked on top of post-quantum cryptography, but that's been an open question and it hasn't been solved, and that would be an area that I'm certain many, many groups would immediately fund, just to have you sit at home and think about the problem. Yes.
Can you also talk about the part of reducing the solution space and brute forcing?
Okay. So the same person who made the same algorithm that I mentioned earlier also came up with a different algorithm back in 2016 based off of a well-known idea. And then he took and formalized that idea. That idea can now be run right now on Qiskit, on IBM's systems. And the idea is guessing half of a bit for a discrete log. And if you can guess even to a significant degree, you reduce the solution space that's required for a discrete log to be solved. And since you know the exact size of the input materials, we know that, for example, Ethereum and Bitcoin always use positive numbers for the elliptical curve, then your brute force becomes much, much smaller and your space becomes much, much smaller. But the most amazing thing about that is you can consistently and repeatedly guess half a bit. So you can just repeat this process 512 times. It works distributed. You can query multiple public keys at the same time. And you can basically guess half a bit on a large number of projects. And you can also take and, in a distributed way, make it so that you know one of the keys, and then if people are returning the correct key, you know that they're doing the work correctly. So it actually has a fraud prevention built into the algorithm. And you can just run that right now on Qiskit. So that's kind of scary. And then it's a guess. It's not 100%. It reveals half a bit at a time. But you can just brute force the remaining solution space with silicon and come up with the correct answer very quickly.
Given the ETFs of Bitcoin and Ethereum, given that there's derivative markets being created for these currencies anyways, does the fundamental underlying principle of blockchain, is decentralization and immutability, matter less in that traditional finance environment, and therefore it's what we're saying, kind of only if it's something that really matters to the cypherpunks and not to traditional finance?
So for the ETFs, they have risk statements. What will impact their value and their business in the long term? And they probably violated their risk statements by not including this in the next 5 years, but everyone thought it was going to take longer. So those Bitcoin ETFs have a regulatory issue with the SEC and other regulatory agencies. The money authorities, but there's also a problem with the idea of permanence and long-term futures. And if everybody knows that the value of Bitcoin is going to become zero by 2027 or 2028 or maybe even 2029, that still destroys the financial forecasts that were made on top of Bitcoin. Well, I'm not sure that they have the ability to pivot because the regulatory approval took so long to get.
No, I mean as a distribution to just sell.
Oh, yeah. They can sell. They can talk about how it's a great time to buy gold and Bitcoin. It's a great time to buy Bitcoin and gold. But that doesn't get them away from their legal responsibility, the regulatory issues, or the fact that their entire business model just turned to zero within a very short time frame.